Chapter 43. And again, just a word of explanation. Reference is made in this chapter to Dick Turpin, a famous highwayman. In one of the stories about Dick Turpin, he is supposed to have grabbed hold of an elderly female, one of his victims, and put her straight on top of a fire, seated her on a fire. He wasn't a very nice person, Dick Turpin. You know this. You need to know this, otherwise a reference made to him later on won't make sense. Why should I pause to ask much of my shrinking from Purvis, which might be traced back to Estella? Why should I loiter on my road to compare the state of mind in which I had tried to rid myself of the stain of the prison before meeting her at the coach office with the state of mind in which I now reflected on the abyss between Estella in her pride and beauty and the returned transport whom I harboured? The road would be none the smoother for it, the end would be none the better for it. He would not be helped, nor I extenuated. A new fear had been engendered in my mind by his narrative, or rather, his narrative had given form and purpose to that fear that was already there. If Compeyson were alive and should discover his return, I could hardly doubt the consequence. That Compeyson stood in mortal fear of him, neither of the two knew much better than I, and that any such man as might be described as he would not hesitate to release himself for good from a dreaded enemy by the safe means of becoming an informer. Such a thing was scarcely to be imagined. Never had I breathed, and never would I breathe, so I resolved, a word of Estella to Provis. But I said to Herbert that before I could go abroad I must see both Estella and Miss Havisham. This was when we were left alone on the night of the day that Provis told us his story. I resolved to go out to Richmond the next day, and I went. On my presenting myself at Mrs. Brandley's, Estella's maid was called to tell me that Estella had gone into the country. Where? To Sattie's house, as usual. Not as usual, I said, for she never had gone there without me. When was she coming back? There was an air of reservation in the answer which increased my perplexity, and the answer was that her maid believed she was only coming back for a little while. I could make nothing of this, except that it was meant that I should make nothing of it, and I went home again in complete discomfiture. Another night consultation with Herbert after Provis was gone to bed, I always took him home and always looked well about me, led us to the conclusion that nothing should be said about going abroad until I came back from Miss Havisham's. In the meantime, Herbert and I were to consider separately what it would be best to say, whether we should devise any pretence of being afraid that he was under suspicious observation, or whether I, who had never yet been abroad, should propose an expedition. We both knew that I had but to propose anything, and he would consent. We agreed that his remaining many days was out of the question. Next day, I had the meanness to feign that I was under a blinding promise to go down to Joe. But I was capable of almost any meanness towards Joe or his name. Provis was to be strictly careful while I was away, and Herbert was to take the charge of him that I had taken. I was to be absent only one night, and on my return the gratification of his impatience for my starting as a gentleman on a greater scale was to begin. It occurred to me then, and I afterwards, to Herbert also, that he might be better got across the water on that pretence, as to make purchases and the like. Having thus cleared the way for my expedition to Miss Havisham's, I set off by the early morning coach before it was yet light, and was out on the open country road when the day came creeping on, halting, whimpering and shivering, and wrapped in patches of cloud and rags of mist like a beggar. When we drove up to the Blue Boar after a drizzly ride, whom should I see coming out of the gateway, toothpick in hand, to look at the coach, but Bentley Drummle. As he pretended not to see me and I pretended not to see him, it was a very lame pretence on both sides. The lamer because we both went into the coffee room, where he had just finished his breakfast and where I ordered mine. It was poisonous to see me in the town, for I very well knew why he had come. Pretending to read a smeary newspaper long out of date, which had nothing half so legible in its local news as the foreign matter of coffee, pickles, fish sauce, gravy, melted butter and wine, with which it was sprinkled all over, as if it had taken the measles in a highly irregular form, I sat at my table while he stood at the fire. By degrees, it became an enormous injury to me that he should stand before the fire. And I got up, determined to have my share of the fire. I had to put my hand behind his legs for the poker when I went up to the fireplace to stir the fire, but still pretended not to know him. "Is this a cut?" said Mr. Drummle. "Oh," said I, poker in hand, "it's you, is it? How do you do? I was wondering who it was who was keeping the fire off from everybody else." With that, I poked tremendously, and having done so, planted myself side by side with Mr. Drummle, my shoulders squared and my back to the fire. "You have just come down?" said Mr. Drummle, edging me a little away by his shoulder. "Yes," said I, edging him a little way with my shoulder. "Beastly place, this," said Drummle. "Your part of the country, I suppose?" "Yes," I assented. "Very like your part of the country." "Not a beast like it," said Drummle. Here Mr. Drummle looked at his boots, and I looked at mine, and Mr. Drummle looked at my boots, and I looked at his. "Have you been here long?" I asked, determined not to yield an inch of the fire. "Long enough to be tired of it," returned Drummle, pretending to yawn, but equally determined. "Do you stow here long?" "Can't say," said Drummle. "Do you?" "Can't say," said I. I felt here, through a tingling in my blood, that if Mr. Drummle's shoulder had claimed another hair's breadth of the room, I should have jerked him into the window. Equally, that if my own shoulder had urged a single claim, Mr. Drummle would have jerked me into the nearest box. He whistled. So did I. "Large tract of marshes around here, I believe," said Drummle. "Yes." "What of it?" said I. Mr. Drummle looked at me, and then at my boots, and then said, "Oh, ho!" and laughed. "Are you amused, Mr. Drummle?" "No," said he, "not particularly. I am going out for a ride in the middle of the day. I mean to explore these marshes for amusement. Out of the way villages there, they tell me. Curious little public houses and smithies and what? Waiter!" "Yes, sir." "Is that horse of mine ready?" "Brought it round to the door, sir." "I say, look here, sir. The lady won't ride today. The weather won't do." "Very good, sir." "And I don't dine, because I am going to dine at the lady's." "Very good, sir." Then Drummle glanced at me with an insolent triumph on his great jowled face that cut me to the heart, dull as he was, and so exasperated me that I felt inclined to take him in my arms, as the robber did in the story-book, said to have taken the old lady and seated her in the fire. I would, with any chance I had, have picked him up and seated him on the fire. One thing was manifest to both of us, and that was that until relief came, neither of us could relinquish the fire. There we stood, well squared up before it, shoulder to shoulder and foot to foot, with our hands behind us, not budging an inch. The horse was visible outside in the drizzle at the door. My breakfast was put upon the table. Drummle's was cleared away. The waiter invited me to sit down and begin, and nodded. We both stood our ground. "Have you been much to the Grove since?" said Drummle. No, said I. I've had quite enough of the Finches the last time I was there. Was that when we had a difference of opinion? Yes, I replied rather sharply. Come, come, they let you off easily enough, sneered Drummle. You shouldn't have lost your temper, you know. Mr. Drummle, said I, you are not competent to give advice on that subject. When I lose my temper, not that I admit having done so on that occasion, I don't throw glasses. Well, I do, said Drummle. After glancing at him once or twice in an increased state of smouldering ferocity, I said, Mr. Drummle, I did not seek this conversation, and I don't think it an agreeable one. I'm sure it's not, said he superciliously over his shoulder. I don't think anything about it, and therefore, I went on, with your leave, I will suggest that we hold no kind of communication in future. Quite my opinion, said Drummle. And what I should have suggested myself, or done, more likely, without suggesting. But don't lose your temper. Haven't you lost enough without that? What do you mean, sir? Waiter, said Drummle, by way of answering me. The waiter reappeared. Look here, you, sir. You quite understand that the young lady don't ride today, and that I dine at the young lady's. Quite so, sir. When the waiter had felt my fast-cooling teapot with the palm of his hand and had looked imploringly at me and had gone out, Drummle, careful not to move the shoulder next to me, took a cigar from his pocket and bit off the end, but showed no sign of stirring. Choking and boiling as I was, I felt that we should not go a word further without introducing Estella's name, which I couldn't endure to hear him utter, and therefore I looked stonedly at the opposite wall, as if there were no one present, and forced myself to silence. How long we might have remained in this ridiculous position it is impossible to say, but for the incursion of three thriving farmers, led by the waiter, I think, who came into the coffee-room, unbuttoning their greatcoats and rubbing their hands before them as they charged at the fire, and we were obliged to give way. I saw him through the window, seizing his horse's mane and mounting in his blundering, brutal manner and sliding and backing away. I thought he was gone when he came back calling for a light for the cigar in his mouth, which he'd forgotten. A man in a dust-coloured dress appeared with what was wanted. I couldn't have said from where, whether from the yard or the inn or the street, or where not, and as Drummle leaned down from the saddle and lit his cigar and laughed with a jerk of his head towards the coffee-room windows, the slouching shoulders and ragged hair of this man, whose back was towards me, reminded me of Orlick. Too heavily out of sorts to care much at the time whether it were he or no, and after all, too suffering to touch the breakfast. I washed the weather and the journey from my face, and went out to the memorable old house that it would have been so much better for me had I never had to enter it, and never even seen it.